poverty, famine, a dream of freedom. These things drove scores of people from Ireland to the New World. But I'm not talking about the blight and the desperate masses who flocked to New York, Boston, or Chicago. Now, the Irish poor I'm talking about today came to our shores over 300 years ago. And the place they found refuge was the misty mountains of Appalachia. This is their story. Now, before I get into it, I would like to pause to humbly ask for a like and a subscribe. Please help us fight the algorithm. Thank you. The saga of the Scots-Irish of Appalachia begins way back in Britain in 1603 with the ascension to the throne of King James VI of Scotland, King James I of England. James was a hugely important figure in the history of Britain in general. It was he who created the so-called United Kingdom. Now, England and Scotland were relatively easy to officially merge politically. It was a done deal as soon as James came to the throne. But James wanted more, just like his predecessors. That is, more permanence, more stability for a lasting Protestant kingdom, and he implemented a number of changes and new laws to get that. Much of which involved promoting the Anglican Church as the official state church throughout his realm. But you could argue that the biggest geopolitical problem James had, which he inherited from his predecessors, was Ireland. Parts of Ireland had been possessions of the English crown since the late 1160s, when Anglo-Norman barons invaded and carved out petty fiefdoms. In 1171, King Henry II claimed dominion over the entire island, though it was actually pretty tenuous from the start. Now, much later, in 1541, Henry VIII was proclaimed officially King of Ireland by the Irish Parliament and entered a long-running war with the Gaelic chiefs. Henry's daughter, Elizabeth, inherited that quagmire. And Henry and Elizabeth had good reason to both fear and seek control over Ireland. The Catholic Gaels, besides fighting the English for their own sake, would also happily harbor Catholic enemies from abroad, especially Spain. For the Brits, it felt like there was a dagger being held right at their throat. Then, in 1593, an even hotter conflict called Tyrone's Rebellion, or the 9 Years' War, erupted. This pitted a confederacy of Irish clans, backed by the Spanish, against the Tudors. Well, by 1603, the Irish had been defeated. And one of the fallouts of that was that many rebel Ulster lords fled the country, leaving their lands to the English. So for James, this was a great opportunity. What followed was a period called the Plantation of Ulster, and it lasted from 1605 all the way through 1697. It was a series of organized settlements in Northern Ireland. Technically, this was not the first time such a scheme had been attempted, but it was the most effective and the most long-lasting for sure. The British Crown offered land grants to anyone willing to settle in the counties of Antrim, Down, Armagh, Tyrone, Donegal, Cavan, Fermanagh, and Derry. For many Scots, particularly from the lowlands, this seemed like a golden opportunity to improve their economic situation, especially people who happened to be landowners already. For many, it also promised greater religious freedom. While the United Kingdom was officially Protestant, the early Presbyterians were often discriminated against by their neighbors. So as many as 200,000 Scots crossed the North Channel to settle in Ulster during this 90-year period. By the 1630s, there were about 20,000 male adult English and Scottish settlers in Ulster, which implies to historians the total settler population could have been as high as 80 or 150,000. It should be noted that this was all technically based on personal initiative. While the British Crown encouraged and cooperated with the immigrants, it was fully a private venture. The landlords were in it for the profit. But if you were not part of the landed class, Ireland was not as free as you had hoped for. The majority of the immigrants lived as sharecroppers, working the estates of the landowners. They couldn't own land themselves, and they had no political voice at all. And ironically, though many came seeking religious freedom, they were required to tithe to the Anglican Church. Pretty galling. Now, at the same time, a unique form of Gaelic culture was sprouting as the new Ulster residents intermingled with the native Irish, and this was the legacy that their descendants would carry to the New World. In the 1690s, a tragic famine caused a new wave of Scottish immigration to Ulster, which resulted in Scottish Presbyterians becoming the de facto majority community. However, despite their numbers, they were still often the victims of discrimination, both by their overlords and by their neighbors who were Catholic. And they were still denied political power. Population pressure and the greed of the landholders caused rents to skyrocket, making times even worse. And resentment of the Church of England was as bad as ever. Many of these common people began contemplating moving to a land that actually did maybe promise economic opportunity and real religious freedom, North America. So starting in the early 1700s, a group that would come to be called the Scots-Irish or the Scots-Irish began migrating to the New World in large numbers. The first immigration wave of 1718 was only about 700 people, mainly Presbyterian farmers and merchants from the Bann and Foyle valleys of Ulster. The Bann Valley group settled in the frontiers of Maine and New Hampshire, while the Foyle Valley group settled in Massachusetts. These were the first, but not the last. By the decade's end, 2,600 more had arrived in New England. But others arrived in Virginia and spread out across the Carolinas. Before the American Revolution, more Scots-Irish immigrated to the continent than almost any other group, and by the 1770s, an estimated 250,000 individuals lived in the American colonies. The majority of Scots-Irish were subsistence farmers. Like other immigrants, they were led to the New World by the promise of cheap land, but more so, they sought a degree of isolation so as to practice their religion finally in peace and avoid those landlords. This made the frontiers of the colonies especially attractive. Anywhere the white man was pushing into Native American land, anywhere resources were thin, the soil difficult to work, or the weather harsh, the Scots-Irish found a home. In fact, many colonies actively recruited these immigrants, offering the desperate newcomers a cheap frontier piece of land in hopes of creating a buffer between colonial civilization and hostile indigenous tribes. And nowhere did this work out better than in the southern Appalachians. Here, the Scots-Irish thrived in a very humble, but also a sustainable lifestyle. They also developed close relationships with indigenous peoples, often including intermarriage. One major arena of cooperation was game hunting and the fur trade. Scots and Scots-Irish often made a living as long hunters and trappers, harvesting deer and beaver hides to sell in the cities. The beaver trade was biggest in the north, while deerskin was most common in the south. Gaels traded and worked alongside tribes such as the Creeks, the Cherokees, the Choctaws, throughout the 18th century and well into the 19th. And this, of course, is partially why so many Americans today can trace their ancestry back to both Gaelic and indigenous peoples. Just one great example of this is James Adair. Born in County Antrim, Ireland, his ancestors lived in both Ireland and Scotland at one time. Like many Scots and Scots-Irish of later generations, he left numerous offspring among the Cherokee. Although Adair was considered a diplomat and a peacemaker among the southern tribes, today he's most remembered primarily as a recorder of indigenous history. In fact, Adair's History of the American Indians, published in London in 1775, is still considered an invaluable account of tribal manners, customs, and language. Scots-Irish immigrants played a strong role during the Revolutionary War, too. Just one example is the Battle of Kings Mountain, South Carolina, October 7, 1780. Here, descendants of Scots-Irish immigrants to Tennessee and Virginia were instrumental in defeating Loyalist militia forces. This was actually a huge deal. Thomas Jefferson later called the battle the turn of the tide of success. So, where are the Scots-Irish today? Well, frankly, they're all over the country. However, the home of the culture they created is still, of course, Appalachia. For instance, today, North Carolina has the largest percentage of Scots-Irish ancestry of any state, with 2.9% of the population claiming that heritage. South Carolina and Tennessee follow at 2.4%. The isolation and, frankly, the poverty of Appalachia made for a unique distillation of elements. Appalachian quilts tell stories in each design. Appalachian foods like chow chow, hoe cakes, chicken fried steak, biscuits and gravy, and fiddleheads are loved by millions. And not to mention, there's also moonshine. Just remember that if you have to pay taxes on it, it ain't shine. Appalachian fiddle music and bluegrass lifts us up and connects people directly to generations long gone. Buck dancing echoes the Irish folk dances of 300 years ago. And finally, there's a certain attitude that these people inherited from those Gaelic ancestors all that time ago. We as Americans like to think of ourselves as no-nonsense, pragmatic, honest, down-to-earth, and just a touch suspicious of authority. I won't say the Appalachians invented that, but they sure as heck live it. Supporting your family by going down in a coal mine every day will do that to you. And that sense of mutual aid, of putting family and community first, is absolutely something they inherited from their Gaelic ancestors. So, if you're of Scots-Irish descent, stand proud. If you love Appalachian culture, I hope you'll consider learning a bit more about its diverse roots way back 300 years ago. Hey, thank you so much for watching. Obviously, this is a very complex topic and it's hard to encapsulate. If you are of Scots-Irish descent and you have family stories or bits of history you love, please share them in the comments. I would love to read them. And if you're interested in more history of Irish culture and the diaspora, check out this playlist over here. Have a great day.